This is me, or at least the sim version of me. For the sake of simplicity, we'll call him C-Sim. C-Sim is playing The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. This tells me two things about him. Number one, his video game palette is extremely refined, and number two, he probably keeps his copy of the game next to his collection of gothic paintings and cardboard cutouts of Tim Burton. Who knew he had such a fondness for gothic art direction? Twilight Princess was a critical and commercial slam dunk, receiving perfect scores from critics, and for quite a prolonged period of time, was the highest selling game in the series until the release of Breath of the Wild. It really needs no introduction. That being said, from a technical perspective at least, no game is perfect, due to bugs, glitches, and technical malfunctions among many other things. Twilight Princess is not exempt from this rule, as the Wii version in particular is plagued by a devastating bug that prevented players from progressing further into the game. Towards the latter portion of the game, Link, with the help of Shad, ends up discovering the Sky Cannon in Renato's basement. This becomes a very integral part of the game's story, as the Sky Cannon is the only means of getting Link to the city in the sky. And of course, in order to do that, it requires the help of this absolute buffoon, and if my memory regarding suspiciously helpful grown men in clown costumes serves me correctly, there's about a 50-50 chance that this guy tried to touch Link inappropriately. So after initially uncovering the remains of the Sky Cannon, you would naturally choose this as the perfect opportunity to save your game, quit, and take a break. However, by saving and quitting your game at this specific moment, you've just activated a destructive glitch that, sadly, renders the game impossible to beat beyond this point. Normally, all you would have to do in order to progress is talk to Shad and ask him to leave the room, to which he obliges. Then, you transform into Wolf Link and warp the cannon to its designated location. However, if you saved your game, closed it, and then reloaded the save, Shad is nowhere to be found. Now, that doesn't sound too bad at first glance. You could just leave the room and come back, except, wait, the developers programmed dialogue from Shad that would prevent you from leaving the room when you try to exit up the stairs. But without being able to find Shad, you can't talk to him in order for him to leave the room. And even when you try to leave the room yourself, Shad's dialogue prevents you from doing so. The only option is to restart the game from the beginning and restrain yourself from habitually saving and quitting the next time you're in this area. Poor C-Sim. All he wanted to do was play Twilight Princess, and now he's left spending the rest of the night wallowing in his sorrow. Cue the cookie dough ice cream and the rom-coms. It's gonna be a rough night. This is what I'm talking about today. Levels or segments in video games that, by virtue of a game-breaking glitch, a developer oversight, or sometimes both, are potentially impossible to complete. Enjoy! If you want the purest example of unexpected success, look no further than 2005's LEGO Star Wars, the first of many LEGO video games developed by Traveler's Tales that ended up exceeding all expectations both critically and commercially, and almost single-handedly set the benchmark for any and all LEGO games released afterwards. This sequel would allow you to embark on the adventures seen in the original trilogy of films, followed by an amalgamation of the two games titled The Complete Saga. I bring this up because the particular oversight I'm talking about today is prevalent in both the original LEGO Star Wars 2 and The Complete Saga. In Level 4 of Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, Luke crash lands in the swampy terrain of Dagobah, where he then meets Yoda, who trains him how to hone in the power of the Force. Now, this level is unique because of how it's programmed. In the first quarter of the level, you play as Luke in his pilot attire, before changing into his Jedi training gear at about the halfway point. Now, since Luke isn't exactly a savant of the Force just yet, he's unable to utilize it to its maximum potential. Instead, you have to interact with Yoda, prompting him to hop on Luke's back like he's about to play a game of chicken and cheat by hitting his opponents with his cane. Little known fact, but Yoda actually has two canes in his possession. The other one's green and resting behind Luke's neck. Eventually, Luke is able to overcome this dependency to Yoda, or he was just sick of Yoda grunting in his ear in the midst of an erection, and is then able to utilize the Force on his own volition. However, towards the end of the stage, you'll stumble across Luke's submerged X-Wing, and after viewing the colored aura that encompasses it, you're either supposed to use the Force to drag it from the swampy depths, or you need to take a break because you might be having a migraine again. Now, this is where things start to get a little interesting. Because Luke is still a mere novice when it comes to using the Force, he's unable to completely lift the X-Wing from the mud, meaning that you have to switch to Yoda in order to do so, thus completing the level. Now, I know what you're thinking, where does the unbeatable level dynamic come into play? Well, look no further than free play mode. Free play mode allows you to replay any previously completed level and allows you to choose any character that you've unlocked up to that point. Whenever you select a character, the game gives you a small, partially randomized roster of other characters that you can choose from by clicking the bumpers on your controller. I say partially because while the characters themselves are randomized, the game is coded to at least give you one of each type of class so that you can complete all optional objectives and puzzles that were rendered inaccessible on your first playthrough. However, if the one force-wielding character that the game chooses happens to be Dagobah Luke and Dagobah Luke only, I hate to break it to you, but you're not going to be able to complete the level. Remember how towards the end of the level, you're supposed to lift up Luke's X-Wing from the mud? Well, the developers didn't consider that someone would want to replay the level as Dagobah Luke in free play mode, because he's hard-coded to be the only Force user in the game that cannot perform the admittedly niche task of lifting the X-Wing out of the mud, which does make sense from a canonical perspective. In terms of a gameplay perspective, however, well, your only option is to quit the level, go back into free play mode, and ensure that you have a Force user in your roster that isn't Dagobah Luke. Funnily enough, this issue would be later rectified in the Skywalker saga, with Dagobah Luke always having Yoda perched up on his shoulders. And later LEGO games would allow you to choose anyone from the full roster whenever you want. Long before the days of games like GoldenEye 64 and Batman Arkham Asylum, licensed games were in a downright abysmal state. Most licensed games could be charitably described as nothing more than egregious cash grabs that had little to no respect towards the very source material that they were based on. LJN was the company most associated with this, as they're now infamously known for releasing not just some of the worst licensed games on the NES era of consoles, but also some of the worst games of all time. A prime example of LJN's disastrous work is none other than their video game adaptation of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the acclaimed comedy noir film that seamlessly blended animation with live action in an unprecedented fashion, while also helping drag Disney out of the financial slump that it was suffering from during the 80s. And by the looks of it, Disney might need Roger's help more than ever right now. But if a sequel is released, don't be surprised when all the 10-year-olds hit puberty a little bit earlier than normal and begin to grow a fondness towards redheads. Sadly, the video game adaptation is nothing more than a bastardized version of the classic film, with monotonous gameplay, formulaic level design, and a severe lack of charm. Despite my disdain for this abomination of a video game, I'll admit that there's one fairly distinctive aspect to it that I think, for the time especially, was pretty immersive and creatively executed. The problem is that this very feature is what ultimately caused the game to become impossible to complete, at least for those who didn't have access to a walkthrough guide or a stable internet connection. At about the halfway point, Jessica Rabbit instructs Eddie Valiant to find her phone number and tells him to give her a call. Given that this game is fairly vague when it comes to providing hints or clues, this is easily the most beneficial and rudimentary set of instructions that you've received up to this point. All you have to do is find a phone and call Jessica Rabbit. But there's a catch. There are no telephones in the game. What does this mean? Well, you actually have to call the number from a real-life telephone in order to receive the clue for your next objective. After calling the number, Jessica Rabbit herself would give you a spiel about where to go next. But interestingly, while the recording itself has been written down and plastered on forums and fan wikis, the audio from the phone call itself is considered a lost form of media, as the recordings of it have yet to be resurfaced online. And I know what you're thinking, well, why don't you just call the phone number and record it from there? Well, the phone number was disconnected in 1990, just 2 years after the game's release. So if you bought this game a couple of years too late and called the phone number, you'd be in a severe state of confusion and made unaware of what to do next. Considering that the internet was in a less widespread and technologically advanced state compared to today, there's a high likelihood that you were confined to magazines and word of mouth when it came to searching for guides. In other words, you were caught in a perpetual loop of scouring every building and every drawer to get at least a modicum of an idea as to what you're supposed to do next. But more than likely, you just gave up on the game and watched the movie instead, proving that you were a psychologically sound human being. Funnily enough, in the early 2010s, James Rolfe, more widely recognized under his moniker The Angry Video Game Nerd, had humorously discovered that the phone number was converted into a sex hotline.
Credit card? Try collect callback. Dial 1215 Sex Talk and we'll call you right back.
So if you were on a retro video game binge and decided to play through this game, you were probably a bit puzzled when you called the aforementioned number and were asked if you've been a naughty boy. The more I think about it though, the more I realize that it's a fairly appropriate question given the circumstances. Why in the fuck are you playing Who Framed Roger Rabbit on the NES in 2024, and what compelled you to partake in such acts of torture? That alone deserves jail time.
My scythe. I like to keep it next to where my heart used to be.
Point-and-click adventure games are notorious for having unintentionally impossible levels that are often caused by either mistakes on the player's part or a severe oversight on the developer's part, or sometimes both. 1998's Grim Fandango, or Fandango, I'm still not sure how to pronounce it, despite being considered a masterclass in point-and-click adventure games, is not immune to this, as it actually contains both of these issues. A notable example comes in the form of the forklift elevator puzzle. Like the name implies, your task is to use a forklift to prevent an elevator from sliding past a specific room. With proper timing and a fair bit of patience, this puzzle is somewhat confusing at first, but becomes much more manageable once you know what you're doing. However, when the remastered version of the game was released, the developers didn't fix a major oversight in which the speed of the elevator was tied to your computer's CPU, meaning that if you had a more advanced gaming PC, as most players did, this was a nigh impossible puzzle that luckily got patched in an update. But then this same update introduced another issue. Players were now getting stuck in the aforementioned elevator and were unable to escape. Luckily, this was also patched in a subsequent update. However, there's another progression averting bug that I'd argue is even more devastating to the player's progress, and ironically can be triggered not too long after that same elevator sequence. Before getting into the elevator, you're supposed to lock up an innocuous server inside of a pantry, before then hiding inside of a barrel to get transported to a secret room. In order to do this, you have to practice a fair bit of patience and wait as the server strolls into the pantry, who is unbeknownst to the fact that we're about to pull a callous prank and then upload it to YouTube and label it as a social experiment. It worked for FouseyTube, and damn it, it's gonna work for me. After closing the door on him, you're supposed to use your scythe as a makeshift barricade on the door before then quickly hopping into the nearby barrel. It sounds complicated, but trust me, in the grand scheme of Grim Fandango's notoriously convoluted puzzles, this is comparatively rudimentary. Now, what happens is that Glottis will eventually discover the perturbed waiter and remove the scythe, which then culminates with Manny being transported to the elevator room. Now, if you were to complete the elevator puzzle and, for the sake of morbid curiosity, choose to lock the pantry with your scythe again and then progress to the next level, well, to put it bluntly, you're screwed. If you want to go to the next level without your trusty scythe in hand, the game doesn't do anything to prevent you from partaking in said action. After all, if the game allowed you to lock the pantry again, even after completing the puzzle, it surely wouldn't forget to check if you have your scythe in your inventory, right? Wrong. Whenever the subsequent level loads up, you'll notice that your inventory is a little lighter than before. And by that I mean, you no longer have the scythe or any means of retrieving it. Now this means that I'm not able to make the vulgar erection joke in which I ask if Manny has a scythe in his pocket or if he's just happy to see me. And that is a cardinal sin in its own right. Hey Manny. Manny, is that a scythe in your pocket? Or are you just happy to see me? Yeah, baby, it's a fucking scythe. Yeah. This wouldn't be an issue if the game did not require you to utilize the scythe in later levels in order to progress. But of course, things can never be so easy. If you've used only one save file for your playthrough, you're forced into starting the game from the beginning, no ands, ifs, or buts about it. You could look at this as a developer oversight of gargantuan proportions, or, and this is where I stand, that waiter from earlier is dishing out some deliciously gratifying revenge.
Good morning, Gary. Wait till I tell you about my crazy dream where the Krusty Krab was closed and meow. Oh, you don't say. You had a dream too?
When it comes to licensed games, animated shows in particular have, more often than not, produced some pretty solid games that are far better than they have any right to be. The most prominent example that comes to mind is none other than SpongeBob SquarePants, one of the most acclaimed and financially lucrative animated shows that Nickelodeon has ever produced. It's the primary breadwinner of Nickelodeon, which is ironic, because there was a show on Nickelodeon aptly titled Breadwinners. It didn't last long because it was fucking awful. SpongeBob has had his fair share of video games, some good, some abysmal, some in between, and some that are beyond the pale. You might think of games like Battle for Bikini Bottom or the movie game, but I'm gonna be fixating on a slightly more obscure title, SpongeBob SquarePants Revenge of the Flying Dutchman. Revenge of the Flying Dutchman holds the distinction of being the first of many 3D platformers that the titular sponge would take center stage in. It wasn't a tremendous success from a critical or commercial standpoint, receiving a fairly mixed response from critics, but it was a charming, thoroughly engaging, and enjoyable 3D platformer, invoking more nostalgic emotions than soul patches, denim, and nu metal. It was the early 2000s after all. Now, if you played this game on the GameCube, you might stumble into the occasional frame rate dip, but for the most part, you'll be able to experience all that the game has to offer with very little complications. However, the PlayStation 2 version in particular has a loading glitch that almost single-handedly causes it to be deemed as the inferior port of the game. Whenever playing through it, all might seem normal at first glance, but for some peculiar reason, whenever you load into an area, whether it's new or old, the game has a tendency to get stuck on the loading screen before then booting you out of of the game. It doesn't sound too detrimental at first, but many players have reported that loading back into the game caused the save data to become corrupted, while others claim that it only affected unsaved data. There's no definitive answer as to why this happens because there are just so many different variables at play. I've seen some claims that say this occurs because the game performs a soft reset on the console in order to circumvent a Sony loading screen policy. Or maybe it only affects certain models of the PlayStation 2, because believe it or not, I actually own the PlayStation 2 version of this game. I've had it since childhood, and to this very day I can fire up my PS2, pop the game into the slot, and play the game from beginning to end without a single crash. No, not that kind. Regardless, this means that a plethora of PlayStation 2 owners were only able to enjoy a small fraction of what the game had to offer before it succumbed to a crash, and to this day, it's still not definitively proven as to what causes this to occur. Sadly, the studio that developed this game, Big Sky Interactive, would be shut down just a year later, and many attribute this to the devastating glitch that plagued the PlayStation 2 version. Who knew that a fucking SpongeBob game of all things would almost single-handedly demolish a studio?
You've crossed the line, General. There are some things I can't forgive. I thought I knew you. I trusted you. And then you...
For the last entry on the list, we're taking a look at a cataclysmic oversight that caused Fallout 4 to be temporarily uncompletable, but it occurred almost a year after the game's initial release. Fallout 4 was the long-awaited entry in the acclaimed RPG franchise, and needless to say, it didn't disappoint. Though the RPG elements of the game were stripped back in favor of a more action-centric gameplay cycle, the game was still lauded as yet another slam dunk in Bethesda's library. Now, Bethesda is no stranger to glitches. I mean, hell, a vast majority of their library contains games that are damn near unplayable on launch, only to get patched later on by both the developers and the most ardent of fans. But the Fallout series in particular has been susceptible to numerous progression-halting bugs, most notably in the form of important characters being killed off, resulting in no means of progression through the story. However, Fallout 4 would mitigate this issue. Almost. Firstly, the game made it to where the more salient characters were unable to be killed in the heat of battle. This can include companions, characters that are integral to the game's plot, and so on and so forth. Of course, this meant that Marcy Long was considered an important character, and this pissed me off because I couldn't kill her. She's such a bitch.
Help out or get lost.
Secondly, Fallout 4 placed a lot of emphasis on integrating factions into the main story. In fact, every single ending of Fallout 4 involves you teaming up with at least one of the 4 main factions to some capacity. There's a high likelihood, however, that you ended up siding with the Minutemen, because they're the only truly neutral faction in the game, meaning that even if you miraculously piss off the other 3 factions by virtue of a glitch or a string of poor choices, the Minutemen will always be at your side. Some call this an unhealthy relationship, but I call it pure unfiltered loyalty. In other words, even if you were the ire of the Brotherhood of Steel, the Railroad, and the Institute all at once, the Minutemen were the effective failsafe that allowed you to progress through the story. And for once, it seemed like Bethesda finally had it figured out. No more important NPCs getting slaughtered, no more faction-related bugs tampering with progress, no more bullshit. And then Nuka World was released. In August of 2016, the final DLC expansion for Fallout 4, titled Nuka World, hit the digital shelves, and while it wasn't quite as well received as the highly regarded Far Harbor, it was still a solid way of closing out the game's nearly year-long schedule of DLC releases. A main selling point of Nuka World is that it introduced a new faction that you could join, the Raiders. The Raiders did not have an impact on the game's main narrative, at least not intentionally, and instead primarily revolved around ravaging the creature-infested theme park's numerous areas and claiming them for different raider gangs that live there. After completing the DLC, you can actually partake in missions that see you and your newly allied Nuka World gangs claiming territory in the Commonwealth, mostly by means of brute force. Now, if you recall, these guys have no impact on the game's main story, at least not intentionally. Emphasis on not intentionally. Whenever the DLC was first released, if you chose to capture settlements throughout the map with the Raiders, the Minutemen would eventually catch wind of this and become a hostile faction towards the player. Even Preston Garvey, as optimistic and cheerful as he is in most circumstances, refuses to talk to you after being made aware of your actions.
Is there anything I can do to make this right between us?
No. Not after this.
Now, as far as I know, this is the only tried and true method of turning the Minutemen against you, as, like I've said before, the Minutemen is the only truly neutral faction in the game. But what happens if you're planning out a fully fledged Raider build with no consideration for the other factions? In layman's terms, what happens if you're sided with the Raiders, but reviled by the 4 main factions? Well, you're fucked. Plain and simple. You see, unlike the other 4 factions in the game, the Raiders have no means of truly eliminating the opposing factions. On top of this, the Raiders don't have any missions, methods, or endings that tie into the game's main story. This meant that the failsafe that was coded into the Minutemen no longer functioned, and you were stuck in a perpetual loop of raiding, merciless killing, and plundering goods with no form of closure when it came to finding out where your son went. You couldn't convince Preston Garvey to allow you to rejoin, and if you were already seen as a villain in the eyes of the other factions, you were shit out of luck. Thankfully, Bethesda recognized this issue and, in a subsequent patch, allows you to still be in most of the Minutemen's good graces. I say most because Preston is still so horrified and taken aback by your actions that he relentlessly lambasts you for trading a life of nobility and virtue for one with bloodshed and depravity. However, he still provides you with missions which successfully grants you the ability to have your cake and eat it too. However, I'm someone who took the moral high road, as I haven't even laid a foot in Nuka World. Instead, I'm providing justice and security to the Commonwealth, and as far as I'm aware, I might be just about done with my noble duties. In fact, I've heard that if you liberate and assist every single settlement in the game, Preston gives you a medal. Let's talk to him.
The settlement has sent word. They somehow managed to drive off a super mutant raid, but they're worried the super mutants will come back in force. You better get over there before it's too late.
I have a better idea. I'm about to make Old Yeller look like a fucking joke.